Once that hormone has gone through the blood, it is going to bind to those receptors and have its particular effect, right? The cell is going to be responsiveness based on some of those things. But before it actually goes to the cell, there's a couple different ways that it could actually go through the blood and bind to where it binds to the receptor in the cell and the effect that it has, right? So these are dependent on whether the actual hormone is a lipid soluble molecule or a water soluble molecule, right? Because we know that though one is polar, one is non-polar, right? They travel in blood differently, and they can also get into the cell in different ways, right? And the other clinical kind of aspect of this is some hormones, right? You can take by mouth. They'll go through the digestive tract because they're not really that big on digesting lipase until it gets way later down. So it can bypass the corrosive effects of the stomach acid, get into your digestive system. And then once they get into the intestinal lining, they're lipid soluble and they can go through the cell membrane, right? With these other types, these water soluble ones, they're going to be broken down usually in the digestive enzymes, and then they need to be passed through the epithelial boundary of the lumen a little different, right? So insulin, which is one of these, you can't just take it orally, right? You can inject it into your bloodstream. So first we'll go over these lipid soluble ones, the ones that can pass, right? They're going to be lipid soluble, non-polar. They're going to be able to pass through the cell membrane, right? So the ones we'll see mostly or we'll run into during the course of these two courses will be these steroid hormones. I'll talk a little bit about these thyroid. And there's that nitric oxide I talked to, which could travel through the cell membranes very easy. But like for steroids hormones, remember we talked about the cellular structure of these, right? And these side groups over here. Here's testosterone that does all the stuff that testosterone does. Here's a certain type of the estrogens or estradiol, right? They look very similar, right? But they just have this small change over here and over here, right? And they have very, very different effects, right? So these both come from cholesterol. Remember that little molecule that was sitting in the cell membrane? There's its polar head, there's its carbon tail, right? But you can modify this to make it one way or another, right? So there's all sorts of enzymes that are messing with these to kind of change them from this to this and a bunch of other steroid cholesterols, right? So these small differences, in fact, when bodybuilders start taking steroids, right, they digest them, they do get into their body, but when their liver gets hold of them, they're like, well, we don't need all these, we don't need all this testosterone, change it into estrogen, right? So, these can be easily swapped, but the receptors, right, a testosterone receptor for this is going to recognize this and not recognize that, right? So these are very different molecules, right? And they're going to exert very different downstream effects because of the receptor that it's tied to. All right, so where is that receptor? This is the next question, right? So there could be a couple of different ways it gets in here, either by transport or free hormones. I didn't talk about this today. I may cover it next time, but maybe not. In any case, there's lipid molecules going through the blood, right? They diffuse out into the interstitial fluid, right? And then they diffuse to the cell and they can go right through that lipid bilayer, right? Because they're lipid soluble. They don't need an outside receptor here, right? And so maybe though the receptors in the cytosol over here, right, the inside cell, or maybe it's going to pass through another membrane, the nucleus membrane, and bind to a receptor inside there. It's going to get through the cell like that way, right? But it's going to bind to a very specific receptor for that, right? It's just going to happen inside the cell, either out here or in the nucleus itself, right? And so usually what this means right here is it's in the nucleus, right? What is it going to do in the nucleus but affect DNA transcription, right? It's going to make certain RNA, which is going to be made into protein, right? So what is this protein though? What is it going to do? Everything. What do proteins do? They do everything, right? So this could be anything right here. It could be an enzyme. It could be a structural protein. It could be anything, right? So these steroids, I mean, they have known effects and everything, but remember, when we're talking about proteins, we're talking about basically proteins are doing everything, right? So if you're affecting the direct DNA transcription, right, ultimately, that's what all these hormones and signals are going to do. But that's when you want to kind of keep this in mind concretely. So here's a couple examples, right? Here's the steroid hormone. It goes in this case, it's binding to one in the cytosol, then it goes into the nucleus. It does something over here, some molecular magic you don't have to know about. But basically what it means is certain proteins are made, right? Which is going to affect either the activity of the cell, but again, proteins could be anything, right? So when you're thinking of steroids, what are you thinking of? You're thinking of this guy, right? Steroids. Steroids come in here. I think this is fake, right? But still, it gets in there and somehow the end effect is here. Steroids do this great, right? They do this great. They've done experiments where they have 3 experimental groups. They have one people not taking steroids, working out. They have another group of people taking steroids, working out. They have a third group of people taking steroids, not working out. And the people who take steroids, who work out, do the best. But the second group of people who take steroids and even don't work out do better than the people who work out. So steroids are great at doing what they do. They have other massive side effects, but they do build muscle, right? And so how do they do that? Right? They make new proteins, right? So let's go back, way back to the beginning where we talked about the structural organization, right? Here's that muscle that we can we can see the muscle on that person, right? And that muscle was made up of these fascicles, which we could also kind of see. And those fascicles were made out of the muscle cells, right? Packed inside those muscle cells were the contractile units that were made of myosin and actin proteins, right? So what the steroid's doing is building up a bunch of more of these, packing these cells more with proteins, right? So here's like the cross view of it, all these little rods in the cell. Over here, you go from this to this, basically hyperplasia. And that's all based on new protein synthesis from and this is what happens during puberty for boys, like all that extra testosterone, your muscles grow. And this is how they're grown, just adding protein to the cells, right? So that's just a concrete effect on something. Usually we talk about like enzymes and stuff because you're going to increase or decrease like metabolism or other cellular activity. But there's also this structural component to it, right? That you can have this, effect that everybody here knows about what steroids do. All right, so, might be an enzyme, might be a membrane protein that's going to affect, affect the steroid response, anything like that, right? It can do all this sorts of things. So proteins, they're doing everything. So when you do have these, you can have all sorts of effects. So bottom line, steroid gets into the cell through the lipid bilayer, either in the cytosol or nucleus, binds to receptor, and that affects the production of new protein. All right, so that was your lipid soluble. That's the example I used was steroids, right? But there's a few others. And they all basically act the same way. Now we have these water soluble hormones, and these are all small, like amino acid like derivatives, or very small amino acid chains, little peptides, right? In a couple of other categories, right? So these are modified again amino acids, right? And as well as basically very small proteins, right? 3 to 49, which is not much, right? So these are all circulated around your blood. There's a couple of major examples, right? All that epinephrine, norepinephrine, or adrenaline stuff, as well as you'll notice here, things like serotonin. What else? Melatonin, you might recognize. Serotonin is also a neurotransmitter. If it's in the blood, it's a hormone. If it's crossing a synapse, it's a neurotransmitter, right? And then other ones you'll recognize like insulin, glucagon, all these ones that are going to be from the pancreas. All right. So these are water soluble hormones and they travel through the blood very easy because they're water soluble. And once they get to the cell, they have a little bit of a different pathway, which we'll talk about here. So like the lipid one, it's traveling through the blood, except it's water soluble, leaves the capillaries, goes through the interstitial fluid, finds its cell, and it's going to bind to a very particular receptor, right? So here's a receptor that only binds epinephrine. And that's this molecule right here is known, what's known in this system as the first messenger, our epinephrine, right? The first messenger. So what that first messenger does is bind to this transmembrane protein, and then you get this big, long chain of events that eventually is going to lead to probably something, well, it's going to have very widespread effects, but it also could lead to gene expression changes also. But it's a little more complicated than what we talk about with the lipid, right? So what happens here is this hormone receptor complex does weird stuff, magical stuff, changes shape, and eventually activates these so-called G proteins. Right? And this G protein then goes on to activate the adenylate cyclase, right? Another membrane protein, right? So you get this chain effect, right, for whatever reason. And what this does over here is convert ATP into cyclic AMP. And cyclic AMP is the so-called second messenger, right? So now we got this excess or more cyclic AMP. Once you got more cyclic AMP, all sorts of crazy things can happen, right? But the usual first step you got is affecting this protein, this particular enzyme called protein kinases. And these protein kinases are enzymes that add a phosphate group to another cellular protein, which is going to affect the activity of that protein, either activate it or inhibit it, right? That's how all proteins basically turn on and off, right? By addition of a phosphate group. It's going to do it through ATP. All right, so this is the first couple steps, right? You've gone from the receptor to this G protein to that adenyl cyclase, right? And then that's going to affect the production of the cyclic AMP, this CAMP, right? Which is the second messenger. All right, so all this is happening up here. This is the figure in your book. I just used the simpler one for something else right there, right? But we were over here when we have these activated protein kinases from the second messenger. And these activated...
It's 1830.
Activated protein kinases go on to activate or deactivate other proteins, which go on to actually produce whatever the physiological response might be, right? And it's such a wide range, I can't even begin to start, right? So once that cycle is activated, right, you get this effect right here. It does whatever this action is right here. After a while, you also have another enzyme, which is going to magically deactivate the cyclic AMP, and then the protein kinase is no longer activated, and then this reaction would stop. Okay, so it's a little more complicated than what we talked about with the other one, but this is your basic intercellular signaling kind of pathways, right? Very complicated chain of events that goes on there, right? But what you want to remember is like G proteins, right? Cyclic AMP is the second messenger, protein kinases as what adds a phosphate group to the protein to activate it or deactivate it, right? Those are key points right there. So the first messenger is your water soluble hormone, second messenger cyclic GMP. So the reason, this is sort of much more complex than even that is that once you start producing this cyclic AMP goes on to target a whole host of different protein kinases, and all those protein kinases have unique functions, right? So the effect of one single molecule of binding has this huge downstream amplifying effect right? Where the cellular response can be huge, right? It can go off in any different direction. And it's also going to be regulated from all different directions, right? You don't have to know any of the particulars here, just that you can amplify the effect of one signal molecule and have a really wide range of downstream effects, right? And people could spend their whole lives studying this little pathway right here, right? It's very complicated stuff. If you take more molecular biology, you'll learn a little bit more about that. All right, one molecule, really widespread effect because of the cyclic AMP could affect so many different processes. Right? And so this is just another slide with a little more detail on it in a little specific example. One single epinephrine, in this case, it is going to have the effect of breaking down glucose in a complicated way, right? So a single molecule of epinephrine, right, is going to have this downstream chain effect where millions of glycogen molecules, remember that glucose storage molecule, breaking it down into glucose. All right, so that is your second messenger stuff. So far we've looked at, the endocrine glands secreted into the bloodstream. They travel through the bloodstream one way or another as lipids or water-soluble molecules. And then they get to their target cell because they bind to specific receptors, right? If you are a lipid-soluble one, you go through the cell membrane and then you cause changes in gene transcription, making more proteins, right? You could always think of that example of the muscle. And then if you are a water-soluble one, you'll go through this complicated secondary messenger pathway with cyclic AMP, with G proteins, cyclic AMP, protein kinases, right, to cause this big widespread effect. So all this stuff is happening inside the cell. But what I want to talk about next is how this epinephrine, not in particular, but how a hormone is, how it knows when to be secreted, right? When do the endocrine glands secrete these hormones and when do they know how to stop, right? So in the next video, we'll look at a very simple system and how the body controls blood glucose levels. See you next time.